Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our third and final read in Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is entitled Racial Facts and Fallacies. Today's read is in the section entitled Summary and Implications. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we are doing this series as a parallel read with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, so I'll put a link in this video's description so you can follow along there as well. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this series, we will be doing an analysis and review at the end of each read. So I'll put a timestamp in this video's description so you can jump to straight to the analysis and review part of the video if that's how you'd like to go about things. So without further ado, let's dive on into tonight's read in Chapter 6, Racial Facts and Fallacies. Summary and Implications. While gross data on differences among racial and ethnic groups are readily available, the inferences to be drawn from those data are highly varied and controversial. The very same set of data can yield radically different conclusions depending on the arbitrary selection of data to be cited and the arbitrary selection of the groups to be compared. If, for example, one omits Asian Americans when comparing blacks and whites, one can miss the fact that the same reasoning which would lead to the conclusion that blacks are discriminated against would lead to the conclusion that whites are discriminated against because they not only are turned down for mortgage loans more frequently than Asian Americans and have to resort to costly subprime loans more often than Asian Americans. A study of the 1990 to 1991 downturn in employment showed that white workers were more likely to lose their jobs than were Asian American workers. Either we believe that white employers are prejudiced against white workers, or we admit that groups can differ from one another in characteristics relevant to economic decisions. Questions about the existence, magnitude, and consequences of racial discrimination cannot be answered with gross statistics, nor even by some of the research methods commonly used. For example, there have been research projects which sent out black and white job applicants with the same objective qualifications, or black and white applicants for housing or loans with the same incomes, and then determined how often or how severely blacks were discriminated against by the difference in the rates at which these matched individuals were hired as employees or accepted as tenants, homebuyers, or borrowers. The fallacy in this approach comes from ignoring the high cost of knowledge and the high cost of making wrong decisions. Neither objective job qualifications nor income tell the whole story for anyone of any race. Other sorting devices may be resorted to when acquiring more specific information is costly, such as seeking more detailed information from previous employers, which many former employers are reluctant to provide given the legal risks they face when providing adverse information, or hiring private detectives to look into the private lives of job applicants, housing applicants, or applicants for loans. Among these sorting devices are hiring by recommendations from existing employees, who have incentives not to jeopardize their own standing with their bosses by recommending someone they know will be wrong for the job. Race, as we have already seen, can be used as a sorting device, even by people who have no hostility to a particular race, including other members of that same race. If, in fact, there are differences among the races in the proportion of people who are desirable as employees, tenants, homeowners, or borrowers, then the use of race as a sorting device may disqualify many individually desirable people, without imposing costs on the race as a whole beyond the cost created by their own behavior. No doubt there were many sober, hardworking, and productive Irishmen who were hurt, due to no fault of their own, during the era when many employers had signs that said, quote, "No Irish need apply," end quote. But that is wholly different from saying that employment and income differences between the Irish as a whole and other Americans during that era represented discrimination rather than behavioral differences when costs were reflected in employment differences. Determining whether economic differences between two groups as a whole are a result of discrimination is wholly different from determining whether individuals have been penalized for things they did not do in situations beyond their control. However much discrimination against individuals may be condemned, it cannot automatically explain income and employment differences between groups. Somewhat similar conclusions were implicit in W.B. Du Bois' 19th century study, which concluded that if all white people lost their racial prejudices overnight, it would not make much difference to most black workers. Though, quote, some few would be promoted, some few would get new places, end quote. Nevertheless, quote, the mass would remain as they are, end quote, until the younger generation began to, quote, try harder, end quote, until the, quote, idle and discouraged, end quote, were stimulated and the whole race, quote, lost the omnipresent excuse for failure, prejudice, end quote. Again, as with the Irish, there may be serious losses to blameless individuals without such losses being able to explain much about the overall income or employment differences between two groups. No doubt Du Bois himself was deprived of opportunities for which he was well qualified, in academia and elsewhere, because of race. But the point here is that such employment discrimination could not explain much of the very large black-white income and employment differential of his time, according to Du Bois' study at the time. Differences in decisions made about matched samples of individuals are misleading as explanations of differences in the economic fate of whole groups when those groups are by no means matched on the relevant factors. Another way of looking at this is that job markets, as in consumer markets, a sharp distinction must be made between those who create certain costs and those who react to those costs by passing the costs on to be paid by others. Just as costs created by criminals in low-income neighborhoods get passed on to be paid by local residents who are not criminals, so the costs created by less productive or more troublesome workers from a given racial or ethnic group get passed on to be paid by other workers from the same groups in the form of reduced job opportunities. Whether either of these actions is a moral question. Whether these are the consequences that such circumstances lead to is an economic question. At one time, it was widely recognized in the black community, as in the Irish or Jewish communities, that the negative impact of the behavior of some elements of their community adversely affected the other and larger elements of their community. Blacks, the Irish, and the Jews all had community organizations, both secular and religious, devoted to reducing the negative behavior of some in the interests of all. But such efforts are reduced or undermined to the extent that all of a group's problems are blamed on outsiders, while group solidarity is maintained internally, even with wrongdoers, at all costs. At all costs. Data problems are by no means the sole, nor necessarily the principal source of racial fallacies. Many people have a large vested interest in seeing racial problems in a particular way. Politicians and activists who have promoted a particular social vision of the reasons and remedies for social disparities have their whole careers at stake, especially after they have portrayed politics and activism as the main sources of both past and future progress, contrary to hard evidence. Others have a heavy psychological or ideological investment in the prevailing vision, in which external causes predominated as explanations of group disparities in income and crime rates, among other things. These external causes range from employer discrimination, to high prices in low-income neighborhoods, to inadequate transportation to get to work. Any questioning of these explanations may bring a charge of quote-unquote blaming the victim. But the very question at issue is whether victimization is the explanation. As for blame, who can be blamed for inheriting a culture that existed before they were born? But while nothing can be done about the past, much can be done in the present to prepare for the future. Whatever we wish to achieve in the future, it must begin in knowing where we are in the present, not where we wish we were, or where we wish others to think we are, but where we are in fact. Both history and statistics reveal the fallacy of the quote-unquote legacy of slavery explanation for current social pathology in America's black ghettos. Senator Edward Brooke, who grew up in Washington's black community in the 1920s and 30s, summarized in a few words what many statistics confirm. Quote, "For young people growing up in America today, stories of my youth will seem almost incomprehensible. It will require the suspension of their sense of reality to picture a time when large areas of Washington, D.C. were truly safe, when families stayed together, neighbors helped one another, students were encouraged to study, and there were no drugs or drive-by shootings." End quote. The world that Senator Brooke described was generations closer to the era of slavery than the generations pervaded by the ghetto social pathology, all too familiar in our own times. Moreover, many remarkably similar pathologies have been found in a study of white lower-class communities in Britain, where none of the familiar explanations of slavery, racism, or discrimination apply. What lower-class white communities in Britain and black ghettos in the United States have in common is a pattern of social pathologies that became pronounced in the latter half of the 20th century, when similar ideas and policies became dominant in both countries. Britain was once one of the most law-abiding nations on earth, but by the early 21st century, its crime rate in most categories was higher than that in the United States. In both countries, politicians, activists, and ideologues who claimed to have solutions instead made many problems worse than before. That concludes Chapter 6. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So I'll try to be brief because the read itself was brief, and the read was just a summary of the chapter that we've already read, which is where the meat of the content is. The short version is, of course, that what needs to be done whenever a hypothesis is introduced is independent variable control. And unfortunately, what you're seeing when it comes to claims of the existence of racism or systems of racism, which we'll get into in a moment, a lot of the studies that are commonly pervade and are commonly performed don't do a sufficient job of independent variable control. Of course, you're supposed to do independent variable control as part of an extension of any element of the scientific method. A lot of times this just isn't done or is done poorly, or there may be an independent variable that's just simply not accounted for, which would potentially make up some of those differences, those disparities in outcomes. Sowell lists a few of those on page 184. We all know about the studies about employment applications and loan applications. And one of the things that he talks about in terms of independent variable controls are information from previous employers. So you could have two job applications that are identical with different names. And what they do is they wind up calling the previous employers and say, hey, did Jim Smith work here? Hey, did John Smith work here? And they might get different answers about these employees from previous employers, hiring private detectives to look into the private lives of job applicants, housing applicants, or applicants for loans, and among these sorting devices are hiring by recommendations from existing employees. So there may be a word of mouth element here that's just not controlled for in these independent variable controls. The other thing that he points out too, which he mentioned throughout the course of this chapter, is the difference between group sorting versus racial animus for the cause of discrimination, even if that discrimination is based on race. There may be certain situations where there's just no good way to get individualized information about the individual, and you wind up resorting to information that you do have and that we do know about the groups to which these individuals belong. In this case, this is a discrimination based on race, but it isn't an example of racism because it may not be necessarily motivated by racial animus, especially when it's presented in as neutral a tone as how I just presented it. Now, Sowell has made clear in various interviews that this is not something he necessarily prescribes. This isn't something that I necessarily prescribe. But it is something that may be acting as a sorting device, which would explain the discrimination without having to resort to racism. Thomas Sowell also explains why these fallacies actually pervade. And he talks about politics and political motivations in the latter half of this read on pages 186 and 187. The one thing that he doesn't really talk about too much is the notion of ad hoc hypotheses. So when we talk about systemic racism, basically what we are taking is actual racism and redefining the word in an ad hoc manner so that the conclusion of the existence of racism can remain regardless of the argument and regardless of the premises. This is called an ad hoc hypothesis, and this is a fallacy. And the easiest example of how ad hoc hypotheses can be built is the thought experiment that Carl Sagan came up with, which is the dragon in my garage. So I tell you there's a dragon in my garage, and then you say, all right, great. Raise the garage door. Let's see the dragon. Well, now I tell you, you can't see the dragon because he's invisible. Well, let's sprinkle some flour on the floor so we can see his footprints. Well, my dragon which is invisible, also hovers, so we won't be able to see his footprints. Okay, well then let's bring in an infrared camera so we can see the dragon's fiery breath. Well, this dragon's fiery breath is actually a cool fire. Okay, so in this case, what we're doing with this dragon in my garage is completely redefining dragon to mean something totally different from what everyone understands the word dragon to mean, so that we can still say it exists, even though it's no longer a reference to the thing that we're talking about, though we're still going to label it a dragon. Though the person who says, I have a dragon in my garage, is still going to label it a dragon. So this is arbitrarily redefining a word to fit a predetermined conclusion. By the way, this is why this is a fallacy rather than an argument, because what we're doing is constantly changing the argument. We're supplanting the actual argument with an ad hoc. In this case, the conclusion is unbending, but the argument is bending. Yuri Bezmenov would label something like this subversion, and this is usually done deliberately, as Sowell points out, to meet a political or ideological end. By the way, this is how you can get to the point of labeling the existence of you create systemic racism as a category so that you can ignore data on Asians when making these claims about discrimination. Sowell points this out on page 183. Either we believe that white employers are prejudiced against white workers, or we admit that groups can differ from one another in characteristics relevant to economic decisions. So he does make a point that it is obviously true that individualized behavioral characteristics that may differ from individual to individual is almost certainly going to result in differences and disparities in outcomes because of those differences in behavior. And there may actually be differences in behavior between group categories. However you decide to group or categorize certain certain groups of people, no matter what those groups are. In this way, we can define away the word racism to exclude certain races from experiencing racism. And this is, I'm sure, how you guys have heard the phrase systemic racism used. So that's going to conclude today's read and today's analysis. And then our next read in Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. Actually, before I do that, I should actually say that Thomas Sowell goes into much greater detail in this, and the difference between disparity and discrimination, and how discrimination can't always explain disparities in outcomes. In his Discrimination and Disparities, I'll put a link to that series in this video's description because I actually read that book on this channel. So if you want to go, he only devotes one chapter basically to that here. If you want to go if you want to see him go into much greater detail on that subject, link is in this video's description. Do check out that series. So anyways, our next read in Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies is going to begin Chapter 7, Third World Facts and Fallacies. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.